All right, it is time to get started. Hello and welcome to TransForm Tuesday. I'm Dave McCormick, VP of Products and Services here at Alpha Software. And today, as I do every Tuesday, I'm going to show you some tips and tricks and ideas that you can use using Alpha TransForm. And I'm also here to answer your questions. So if you do have any questions, go ahead and type them into the questions box of the GoToWebinar control panel. I'm joined today by Sarah Mitchell, who's in charge of documentation, who can also point you to useful answers to questions. If you want to type them into the questions window, she can also help you out there. So let's get started. First of all, I want to make sure everyone can see my screen and whether or not you can hear my voice. If you could just let me know, or actually, Sarah, since you're live, can you just chime in and let me know if I'm coming through?
Yep, I
Okay.
can see everything.
Okay, awesome, thanks. All right, today we're going to jump down here to slide 188. And today we're going to be talking about authenticating web application users with TransForm. Now, some of you know exactly what I mean by that, but let me just put this in context for the whole rest of you. Imagine that you had Alpha TransForm, but you wanted to use it as part of a bigger solution. Like let's say you were using it as part of a field services solution. So besides just the regular TransForm Central and the TransForm app, maybe you've created a couple of custom reports that went around with it, but maybe you wanted to also create this custom sort of dashboard, like a new type of portal that you could log into that would give you more than what you get out of the management console. For example, let's say you wanted to have a dashboard. Let's say you had a lot of people who were out performing field service type of activities. You wanted to see who your best performers were, or maybe you wanted to click on a map and see where they were on a map. The weather forecast information here might be useful for your dashboard. It might not be. And there might be some other things as well that you want to display, like maybe how many of the service tickets were closed on time and other information like that. So these are things that you can build really quite easily using Alpha Anywhere. But the notion is that once you use Alpha Anywhere, you now have a separate system. So that creates a little bit of a problem because this type of information you're going to need to password protect, right, behind a login. And so the question is, do you have the users log in to two systems? At first, that might be okay, but the question is, can they use the same username and password for both systems? And if you make them use different usernames and passwords, well, chances are they're going to end up using the same one anyway on both systems. But when they change one, they're going to forget to change one on the other, and they're going to get confused, and it's going to become sort of a logistical issue. So it would be much better if we could just have one username and password that accessed all things TransForm, whether it's TransForm Central, the TransForm Filler app, or any new application or dashboard that you would like to build. So we're going to talk about how you could do that today and how you could do that using Alpha Anywhere, as well as pretty much any other development product. So let me show you what I'm talking about. Over here, let's imagine we have a user and they've typed in their username and password because they're interested in logging into your web application. So in this case, I have Alpha Anywhere a little bit smaller than TransForm because it could be some other system besides Alpha Anywhere. But in this case, we'll use Alpha Anywhere. And we basically just pass along the username and password. We don't even have to save them. We just pass them directly to Alpha TransForm using the API. And what TransForm will tell us is whether or not they were able to log in successfully using those credentials. Now that's part one of what you need to do. The next step will be to check to see whether or not, okay, I see that you have a good username and password, but do you have the right permissions to log into this? So if you recall in TransForm, let me just pop over here, Alpha TransForm, we have these things called called user roles. And here I've set up different user roles for the different users in my account. So for example, for me, I'm an account administrator, but I'm also a form designer. I have access to the management console. I'm a supervisor and I'm a user. Sarah has similar rights, but she's not an account administrator. And this user here that's simply called guides@alphasoftware.com really only has two things it can do. It can use the management console and it can be a user. Now we might want to decide that for our portal, We only want to allow account administrators to use that portal. So I'm going to pop back over here to PowerPoint. Where did you go? There it is. And we're going to make a second request to the API. And this time we're going to say, okay, so API, does this user have the necessary permissions? And we will have defined what the right permissions are ahead of time here in this web application. And the answer to that will either be yes or no. But if it is, then we're going to give access to that web user. Now over here, you probably noticed I have something called a SQL database and password lookup. I'm going to get into that in a moment. And this has to do with Alpha Anywhere's security framework. Because once you have authenticated here, you want them to be logged into your application. And there's a couple of little programming tricks that you can get to make that happen, which I'm going to talk about a little bit later. But let's for now just work on this process, authenticating a user and checking to see that they have the right permissions. So starting over here, the login component, let me show you what I've built for a login component here on this next slide. It's just a UX component for those of you who are familiar with Alpha Anywhere. It's sort of like a form builder that can be used on both mobile and web if you wish. Our intention here is for web though. And in my UX control, I've laid out 6 different controls: an email, which is a text field, another text field called password, a checkbox field called remember me, a hyperlink for forgot your password, this thing called error text, which is a text area that appears right here, and a login button. Now the email and password fields are pretty obvious what they do. They're for collecting the email and password. Remember me, I'm not going to get into that, but it has to do as to whether or not you want to have the email pre-filled the next time they show up there, and it has to do with whether or not you're going to read a cookie from the browser. I'm not going to go over that today because it's not actually essential for you to know in order to log in using TransForm. And then the last part here is this login button, and this is the thing that makes everything go. The login button actually performs an AJAX callback, and it calls an XBasic function, and that XBasic function does all of the authentication that I showed here. It's going to pass along the username and password. It's going to see if it worked. It's then going to check the user roles and make sure that it has the right role, and then it's going to give some feedback to the user to indicate that it's been done. Okay, so I'm going to go into 3 pages of code, which is a lot, especially since TransForm is a no-code system, but this is Alpha Anywhere. And these 3 pages are actually pretty easy. The last page is just some pseudocode that I'm going to show you at the end. The first page is where I just set up some variables and some parameters, and there's really only one page where we actually do the work, and I'm going to walk you through all of these. So let's begin with setting up the variables that we want to use at the beginning. Well, first of all, because this is an AJAX callback, we're going to need, with the callback request, the information that the user filled into the email and password boxes, and we get that out of the e variable, e.datasubmitted.email. And for password, it's just e.datasubmitted.password. Okay, so that's easy enough. That's what the user typed in. The next thing we're going to have built in here is the API key. This is the API key to TransForm, because you're going to need that to make those API calls. These 2 I'm not using, but I've just set them to null. Actually, this one I'm not using. I've just set it to null for now. This is going to be a SQL connection string. I'm not going to get into the point now where we do a lookup to a table, but I'm going to show you how we do that later on. And this is just another thing here. Now, in each case, I could have also just dimensionalized these. I could have said dim cn as c or dim post data as c as well. I find it just as easy to use this format. The next variable I'm setting is the user fail message, of which there are 2 types of user fail messages. The first one is the message that the user should get if they've typed in a username and password that's just a bad username and password, right? And so here I've set it to the username and password combination was not recognized, please try again. But there's another type of failure that it can occur, and that's if they don't have the role. We haven't set up the role for them properly in TransForm Central. So their username and password is perfectly good, but they don't have the role that they need in order to access this. So we just say, I'm sorry, you're not allowed to authorize, you're not authorized to use this portal. Please contact your administrator. All right, the next part is a success URL. I'm not going to get into that right now, but this one I am, required role, account admin. So just as you knew, there are form designers and supervisors and account admin. This is the way that the API will report back the role known as account administrator. They call it account admin. And so by filling this in, I'm going to say I'm only interested in people who are account admins to have access to my system. And the last thing I've done is I've just set up a variable that's set to authorized, which I've defaulted to false. But if later on in the code it passes the right test, it's going to be set to true. And we're going to use that on that final page, if authorized, to do some other stuff. Okay, so now let's dive into the meat of this right here. Okay, so we're using two API methods, two TransForm API methods. The first one is called login, which I've got over here, and the next one is get user roles and account. Now, login is a new one which has just been exposed in the API Explorer. So let's go over to Alpha Anywhere and take a look at that. Here I am at Alpha Anywhere. I have the latest release, and I'm going up to Tools, and I'm going to choose Alpha TransForm API Explorer. And here are all the things that the Alpha API can do. And one of them is simply called login. So for login, I could type in a username and a password and click test, and I'm going to get some results. So let's go ahead and do that. And I'm going to type in complete gibberish into both of them. So that should absolutely fail, but it'll be interesting to see what we get back. So I'm going to hit test. And this is what we got back. Well, the first thing it said is error equals false. And you're probably thinking, wait, that was gobbledygook. Don't you mean there should be an error? No, all that means is that we sent the request properly and it understood the request. And so there were no errors there. But it also gave us back this other data chunk here called result. And result has got two fields in it. One's called login OK and another one's called reason. And login OK has been set to false. Now, I'm pretty sure everyone here knows what that means. That means that was the login okay? It was not okay. So login okay is false when you don't do it properly. If you do it properly, login okay is going to be set to true. So we're going to need that. So let's go back to our script. And I put it in PowerPoint just because it's easier to read. And we're going to see if, starting up here, we're going to set up this login X basic code. Actually, I'm not even going to bother with that because the way I did it was back in here after I had tested this out is I went over here to click this X basic tab, bang, and it gave me all of this information. It gave me all of the stuff that I needed to do if I wanted to write this myself. So I actually just copied this and pasted it into my own script back here. Let's go back to PowerPoint Transform. All right, so here we are, and we're going to use a special function in Alpha Anywhere called A5 dialog helper underscore transform API query. It's basically the thing that it's part of the code that it's given us before. It's right here. It's the same dude. And it takes three parameters, the URL, the data, and the API key. Let's pop back here to PowerPoint. And so what we've passed in this time is we've passed in the username that we got from the user and the password that we got from the user, and our API key, which I had listed above, and we run this function. And we take the result of the function and we put it into a variable called PR. Now, if PR has an error, which it really should never do if you form the request right, so even if the username and password are wrong, you still shouldn't have an error. But if it doesn't have an error, the first thing I want to do is check to see whether that login OK variable was set to true. And because this whole thing evaluates to either true or false, I can just use that in an if statement. So if the login was OK, then, and I put a little comment down here, okay, we know the username and password is good. Let's see if they're permitted to use the portal. So the next thing we do is we set up our second call, and this time we're setting it to get user roles in account. Let me show you that one. Back over here in Alpha 5, get user roles in account. By the way, since there are so many methods, we put this little filter thing up here. So if I just said like get user, here we go, get user roles in account. It narrows down what I'm looking for. This is get users, this is get user roles. So for here, I just have to type in the user ID, and it knows from the API key which account I'm talking about. So I'm going to say, that's my user ID. I'm going to test it. And look what I got back. I got back for my result that I'm the account admin, I'm a form designer, management console, supervisor, and user. Now I had that other user, which I showed you before, called guides. I'm going to test that one out. You're going to see the result set there is different. In fact, they don't have any permissions whatsoever. I believe I shut them all off for guides. Okay, that's cool. So we're going to go back here to our script. Whoops, let me close out of the API Explorer. And I'm going to go back to PowerPoint. And again, we're going to use that dialog helper transfer API query function. And again, we probably won't get an error, even if we give it weird information. It's just, so if there is no error, what we want to do is we want to find out what the result was. Now that result, like you saw in the case of when I entered Dave at alphasoftware.com, I had like 5 different results. So what I'm going to need to do is I'm going to need to loop through those results, right? And I'm going to need to check to see whether or not one of those results is our required role. And if it is, I'm going to set a variable equal to true. So I'm just using a for each statement. So for each role in my result set, check to see if the role that I got back is equal to the required role that I had previously set up here, account admin. And if it does equal account admin, go ahead and set the authorized to true. Okay, great. So I'm going to hit next, and around it goes into that loop, and it comes out, and at the end of it, authorized is either set to true or it's set to its default value that we did before of false. Okay, great. Now, we're going to go a little bit further, and we're going to say, if it is authorized, then what I want you to do is I want you to set this variable login equal to this bit of text, which is in fact JavaScript, because that's what we need to return in our AJAX callback. That's how AJAX works. And what we're going to do is we're going to set a value of error text to please wait. So wait, what was error text? Let me go back and show you. Some of you are already ahead of me here, I'm sure, but error text is the name of our field here on our login control. So what we're saying is we want to set that value, and this is, by the way, a read-only field to the user. They can't type into error text. I've set it that way. We're going to show to the user just the words, please wait. Let me just jump down to the code that I'm supposed to use, please wait. In all other cases, in the first case, by the way, if they had failed, the default thing we were going to do was set that login variable equal to this JavaScript, one where we set the value of error text to the user fail message. And the user fail message is the one which says the username and password were not recognized. So there's one last case. If the username and password were recognized, but you still didn't have permission because you didn't have the right permission roles, we want to instead set login equal to this bit of JavaScript text, which sets error text equal to not authorized, and not authorized is again a variable that we set up here saying, I'm sorry, you're not authorized to use this portal. So the result of running all of this code should be, if the username and password are good and you have account admin, we're going to see the word message, please wait. If your username and password are bad, you're going to see the message which says the username and password was not recognized. And if the username and password are good, but you don't have the role, we're going to use not authorized. All right. So that's how the code works. Let's pop over so I can show it to you. So here I am in my login component. Let me just open that up. So this is what I'd shown you before, the login component. I'm going to pop over here to working preview, and I'm going to show you a couple of different examples. So example one, I'm just going to type in a whole bunch of gobbledygook into the username and password, and I'm going to click login. And what it's done is it's gone out to the TransForm server and it said, oh, this username and password combination was not recognized. Please try again. So this time I'm going to put in guides at alphasoftware.com. And if you recall, the guides account, while has a good username and password, that is if I type it in properly, let me see if I get that. It is not authorized. It doesn't have a role that allows me to do it. So if I've done this properly, it says, I'm sorry, you're not authorized to use this portal. Please contact your administrator. And last, if I actually type in a username and password, which is both good and has the proper permissions, which I'm going to do right now. If I remember my password, I think that's it. I'm going to get that please wait message. So that is all working. Now the question that you might have is, okay, that's great, what's next? Well, that please wait message could have also been a redirect to another page, and that other page could be the page where my portal is in. But I want to talk about something else, because when I build this out, I actually want to use the Alpha Anywhere security framework. Let me go back to the PowerPoint and explain that a little bit. So with the Alpha Anywhere security framework, anytime I add new pages and stuff, it will automatically check to see if I have a logged in user and whether or not that logged in user has permission to hit that page. And it's a very convenient thing so that I don't have to write that logic on each one of those pages. I'm just going to use the security framework. But I don't want to make the user have to like type in their username and password a second time. I mean, we could have said to TransForm, hey, is that a good username and password? And they came back and said yes. Then we're like, present you with another login box to actually log into the app itself. That'd be silly. What we want is we want the system to automatically log you into your application behind the scenes. So this is the pseudocode, and I should have real code for this within a couple of days or so. And the pseudocode says, first of all, check to see if they have a username in the security framework. And there's actually a function for that, and that function is called getUser. So if I said getUser, I would get back a list of all of the users in the system, and I can compare the email of the users there to the email that the user had entered. Let's say they weren't there, though. They were not in the security framework. Well, I don't want to have some administrator go in and set them up in my portal. I'd like that to happen for me automatically. So this is what I'm going to do. If I don't see them as a user, what I'm going to do, if I don't see them in the security framework, is I'm going to create a new user and I'm going to assign them a role. This isn't a TransForm role. This is an Alpha Anywhere role this time, but I'm going to use them a role that's required by the security framework. And then I'm going to generate a password for them, and I'm going to store it in a SQL database so I can access it later. Now, this is a password that's secret. Not only the user doesn't even know the password, it's created literally by the system. It's put into a table. No one touches it except for the system. But the point is that it's the one that the security framework accepts. So then last, at this point, we know that they have an account because we've either found it or we've built it. And we know that they have a password because when we created an account, if it weren't found, we set that password into a SQL database. So what we're going to do is we're just going to take their username, use it to look up their password that we created from the SQL database, and use that username in combination to log into the security framework. And so here are the functions that we're going to use to do that. But like I said, we're not going to quite get to that today. So getUser method is the one that I showed you before. That makes sure that the user does in fact exist in the security system. If they don't exist in the security system, we're going to create that user, which is just simply passing along a username and a password. So we will have generated a password ahead of time. And then the last thing is, because every user needs to have at least one role in the security framework, that's how it works, we're going to add a role to that user using a user method. And then last but not least, we're going to do a SQL lookup, and then with their username and their password, we're going to use this login method here. So all of this stuff can be found here in documentation.alphasoftware.com, these methods. They're going to be, there are multiple, there's sort of like two conflicting sets of security methods that you can find. The ones you want to use nowadays, though, the newer ones, absolutely you should use, are the context ones. So any security method you have should start with context.security something. So context.security get users, context.security login, context.security create user, and also add user to role. So those are the ones, don't use the other ones. That's my advice to you there. So that about wraps up the explanation. I believe that I've shown you. Here, let's go back here and we'll talk about sort of the whole thing start to finish again. So our final system, when we add that last bit of code, will be the user enters in their username and password. We pass it along to Alpha TransForm. We check to see whether or not they are a registered user there. If they are, we check to make sure that they have the required role necessary to access our web application. If they do, we're going to take their username and use it and check to see, actually check in the web application security framework to see whether or not they are a user. If they're not a user, we're going to make a user account for them in our web application because we know they have a good account here in Alpha TransForm. We're relying on TransForm to basically for the trust aspect of it. And then lastly, we're going to save or load a password that we've generated here so that it can be used in the Alpha Anywhere security framework. So I hope I haven't confused anyone too badly. Certainly if you're new to Alpha Anywhere, I'm sure this is a bit confusing, but I hope you guys found this helpful. Do we have any questions today? That's it. Someone seems to have is asking about the next section of the user's guide. I was hoping it would be this week. It probably is going to be next week, and it's going to cover the TPL TransForm programming language. So a lot of the stuff actually that you've seen here in these TransForm Tuesday webinars were used in the creation of the user's guide and vice versa. So hopefully I should have something out for you, say end of next week in PDF format. All right, well, if that's it, hey, thanks everyone for showing up. I really appreciate it. And I hope to see you next Tuesday at our next TransForm Tuesday. Take care and have a great week. Bye-bye.